Imagine working 7 years to build your career at a company you believed in. You've sacrificed weekends, skipped vacations, and poured your heart into every project. Then, on the day you share the happiest news of your life, that you're going to become a mother, everything changes. Within 48 hours, you're sitting across from HR with a termination letter in your hands. This is Jessica's story, and what happened to her reveals a disturbing reality that too many women still face in American workplaces. Quick note before we begin. This is a fictional, dramatized story for education and entertainment. Any resemblance to real people is coincidental. This story is inspired by common workplace discrimination situations people talk about online. All names and details here are fictional. Jessica Morales had always been a fighter. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Phoenix, she watched her single mother juggle 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. That experience forged something unbreakable in Jessica, a determination to build a stable, successful life for herself. By 32, she'd achieved exactly that. As a marketing manager at TechVision Solutions, a growing software company in Scottsdale, Jessica had climbed from an entry-level coordinator position to leading a team of 8. She was proud of what she'd built. Her campaigns had increased client engagement by 40%. Her team respected her. And her boss, Richard Chen, had recently hinted at a potential director position opening up within the year. Life was finally coming together. And then came the ultrasound appointment that changed everything. Jessica stared at the small black and white image in her hands, tears streaming down her face. She was 8 weeks pregnant. She and her husband Marco had been trying for almost 2 years, enduring the monthly disappointments, the expensive fertility consultations, the strain it put on their marriage. And now, finally, this miracle. That evening, Jessica and Marco celebrated quietly in their apartment, already dreaming about nursery colors and baby names. But Jessica's mind kept drifting to work. How would Richard react? The company had never had a senior female employee take maternity leave before. Most of the women in leadership positions were either childless or had grown kids. Jessica sat across from her team during their Monday morning meeting, feeling the secret growing inside her like a warm light. She decided to wait until the 12-week mark to announce it, the safe point her doctor had mentioned. But 3 days later, morning sickness hit her so severely during a client presentation that she had to excuse herself. Word started spreading in the office. Jessica knew she couldn't wait any longer. On Thursday afternoon, she scheduled a meeting with Richard in his corner office. Her hands trembled slightly as she knocked on his door. Richard looked up from his computer, gesturing for her to sit down with his usual efficient wave. "Richard, I wanted to share some personal news with you," Jessica began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm pregnant. I'm about 9 weeks along and everything looks healthy. I wanted to let you know now so we can plan ahead for coverage during my maternity leave." She watched Richard's expression carefully. There was a momentary pause, just a fraction of a second, where something flickered across his face. Surprise. Concern. It vanished so quickly Jessica wasn't sure she'd seen it at all. "Well," Richard said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Congratulations, Jessica. That's big news." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll definitely need to discuss the logistics. Let me think about this and get back to you." The meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. Jessica left feeling unsettled, though she couldn't pinpoint why. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the hormones were making her read into things. But Jessica's instincts were right to sound an alarm. Because what happened over the next 2 days would reveal a calculated pattern of discrimination that had been hiding in plain sight at TechVision Solutions all along. The next morning, Jessica arrived at her desk to find an unexpected email waiting for her. It was from HR requesting an urgent meeting, scheduled for 3 p.m. that same day. The subject line read, "Organizational Restructuring Discussion." Jessica's stomach dropped. In corporate speak, restructuring rarely meant good news. She tried to focus on her work, but anxiety gnawed at her throughout the day. By the time 3 p.m. rolled around, Jessica's hands were ice cold as she walked to the HR conference room. Inside, she found Richard and Diane Murphy, the head of human resources, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and an unreadable expression. A folder sat closed on the table between them. Diane slid the folder across the polished conference table toward Jessica. "Jessica, we need to discuss some performance concerns that have come to our attention." Diane began in a tone that was professional to the point of coldness. Performance concerns. Jessica felt like she'd been punched in the gut. Just 3 weeks ago, she'd received a glowing quarterly review. Her team had exceeded every metric. What was happening? "I don't understand," Jessica said slowly. "My last review was excellent. Richard, you specifically praised the Davidson campaign results." Richard wouldn't meet her eyes. He studied his hands instead, leaving Diane to continue. "We've been monitoring some issues with deadline management and team collaboration," Diane said, opening the folder to reveal several printed emails and documents. "Additionally, we're implementing a departmental restructuring that will eliminate your current position." Jessica's vision blurred at the edges. She forced herself to breathe, to focus. "This is about my pregnancy." "We don't discriminate based on pregnancy status," Diane replied quickly. Too quickly, as if she'd rehearsed the line. "This is purely a business decision based on performance metrics and organizational needs." But Jessica had worked in corporate environments long enough to recognize a script when she heard one. The timing was too convenient. The documentation too sudden. The whole thing reeked of manufactured justification. What Jessica didn't know was that this wasn't the first time TechVision had pushed out a pregnant employee. And the paper trail they'd created to protect themselves was about to unravel in ways Richard and Diane never anticipated. Jessica walked out of that building in a daze, her termination letter and final paycheck in hand. They'd given her 2 weeks of severance. Barely anything for 7 years of dedicated service. The official reason listed on her termination paperwork was position elimination due to restructuring, carefully worded to sound legitimate. That night, Jessica couldn't stop crying. Marco held her on their couch, furious and helpless. They just signed a lease on a bigger apartment to accommodate the baby. Their entire financial plan had been built on Jessica's salary and benefits. Her health insurance. The maternity leave she'd been counting on. "We're going to fight this," Marco said, his jaw set. "This is illegal. They can't do this to you." But Jessica felt defeated. Fighting meant lawyers, money they didn't have, time and stress while she was pregnant. She thought about all the women who'd probably experienced the same thing and just absorbed the blow. Moved on. Stayed silent. For 3 days, Jessica barely got out of bed. Depression settled over her like a heavy blanket. She was mourning more than just her job. She was mourning her identity, her financial security, her sense that hard work and dedication actually mattered. On the 4th day, Jessica's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Is this Jessica Morales?" a woman's voice asked. "My name is Angela Park. I used to work at TechVision Solutions. I heard what happened to you, and I think we need to talk." Angela had been a senior project manager at TechVision 3 years earlier. She'd been fired 2 months after announcing her pregnancy, officially for failure to meet project deadlines, though her performance reviews had been stellar. She'd been too exhausted and overwhelmed to fight it at the time, focused on preparing for her baby's arrival. But Angela had kept her documentation. Every email, every review, every piece of evidence that contradicted TechVision's official narrative. And through a professional network, she'd heard whispers of at least 2 other women who'd experienced the exact same pattern. "They have a system," Angela explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They wait until you announce your pregnancy, then suddenly discover performance issues that never existed before. They document things retroactively. They create a paper trail designed to look legitimate. And they count on you being too scared, too tired, or too financially desperate to fight back." Jessica's despair began transforming into something sharper, something harder. Anger. "What do we do?" Jessica asked. "We find the others," Angela said. We build a case. And we make sure they can never do this again. Over the next 6 weeks, Jessica and Angela uncovered a pattern that was even worse than they'd imagined. And the evidence they gathered would ultimately bring TechVision Solutions to its knees. Jessica sat at her kitchen table surrounded by printed documents, her laptop open to a spreadsheet tracking every detail. Through Angela's network, they'd found 5 other women who'd been pushed out of TechVision after announcing pregnancies over the past 7 years. 5 women with nearly identical stories. Excellent performance reviews followed by sudden concerns, convenient restructurings, carefully worded termination letters. But the smoking gun came from an unexpected source. One of Jessica's former team members, a young woman named Priya who was disgusted by what had happened, secretly forwarded internal emails she discovered while helping clean out old files. In those emails, Richard had explicitly discussed managing the maternity leave situation with Diane and the CFO before Jessica had even been officially notified of her termination. They discussed the financial liability of keeping pregnant employees. They'd strategized about documentation that would protect the company from discrimination claims. They'd put it all in writing. Jessica contacted an employment attorney named Robert Chen, who specialized in discrimination cases. When he reviewed the evidence, his eyes widened. "This is one of the most clear-cut cases of pregnancy discrimination I've seen in 20 years, Robert said, his voice almost awed. They documented their own illegal behavior. They were so confident they wouldn't be challenged. They didn't even try to hide it properly. 6 months later, Jessica stood in a federal courthouse, her hand resting on her now prominent baby bump. Robert had filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of Jessica and the 5 other women. The case had attracted media attention. TechVision's reputation was hemorrhaging. Several major clients had pulled their contracts, citing concerns about the company's ethics. The company's lawyers had initially postured aggressively, but as the evidence mounted, and as the press coverage intensified, their position weakened. Settlement negotiations began. Jessica felt her baby kick during one of those negotiation sessions, a reminder of what she was fighting for, not just for herself but for her daughter, for all the women who'd be silenced if this behavior went unchallenged. The final settlement would shock everyone involved. But more importantly, it would force TechVision to implement changes that would prevent this from ever happening again, changes that would ripple across the entire industry. The day the settlement was finalized, Jessica sat in Robert's office reading through the terms. TechVision had agreed to pay $2.4 million total to the 6 women, with Jessica receiving the largest portion due to the strength of her evidence and the timing of her termination. But the monetary settlement was only part of it. The company was required to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees and management, establish an independent review board to investigate any future pregnancy-related terminations, create a transparent maternity leave policy that guaranteed job protection, publicly acknowledge that improper terminations had occurred, and submit to 5 years of federal monitoring to ensure compliance. Richard Chan and Diane Murphy were both terminated. The company's board issued a public apology. But perhaps most satisfying for Jessica was the personal letter she received from TechVision's new CEO, a woman named Sarah Martinez who'd been brought in specifically to rebuild the company's culture. Sarah apologized directly for what had happened and invited Jessica to consult on the new maternity leave policies being developed. 3 weeks later, Jessica gave birth to a healthy baby girl she named Sofia. As she held her daughter for the first time, Jessica thought about all the moments she'd almost given up. The nights she'd cried herself to sleep. The times she'd wondered if fighting was worth it. Looking at Sofia's tiny perfect face, she knew it had been. The settlement money meant she could take a full year off to bond with her daughter without financial stress. It meant she could choose her next career move carefully on her terms. It meant Sofia would grow up with a mother who'd taught her that standing up for what's right, even when it's terrifying, even when it costs everything, that's what actually matters. 6 months after Sofia's birth, Jessica accepted a position as director of marketing at a company known for its progressive family policies. On her first day, she met 3 other mothers in leadership positions, all of whom had taken maternity leave and returned to their roles without incident. It was such a simple thing, so normal in many developed countries, yet still frustratingly rare in American corporate culture. But Jessica also did something else. She started speaking publicly about her experience. She gave talks at universities and professional conferences. She worked with advocacy groups fighting pregnancy discrimination. She made sure her story reached women who were going through similar situations, so they'd know they weren't alone. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. If you're finding value in this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you've ever experienced a similar workplace discrimination situation, feel free to share your story in the comments. Today, Jessica's daughter Sofia is 2 years old. Jessica has built a successful career that allows her to be present for her family while still doing work she's passionate about. And Tech Vision Solutions. After the settlement and restructuring, they actually became an industry leader in family-friendly policies. Proof that sometimes even bad actors can be forced to change. But Jessica knows that her story, while it ended well, represents just one victory in a much larger battle. Pregnancy discrimination affects thousands of women every year. Many never get the smoking gun evidence she was lucky enough to obtain. Many can't afford to fight. Many are in states with fewer worker protections or work for companies that are better at hiding their illegal behavior. The laws protecting pregnant workers exist. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 explicitly prohibits employment discrimination based on pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions. But laws only matter if they're enforced. And enforcement requires that women who experience discrimination have the courage, resources, and support to stand up and fight. Jessica's message to anyone facing similar circumstances is simple. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Reach out to employment attorneys. Many work on contingency and offer free consultations. Connect with advocacy organizations. You are not paranoid. You are not overreacting. And you are not alone. Because the thing about fighting for what's right is that even when it's terrifying, even when the odds seem impossible, even when you're exhausted and pregnant and wondering if you have the strength, you do. You absolutely do. And sometimes fighting back doesn't just change your own life. Changes the system itself.